The fact that they're not really saying very much about the fact that the Houthis or Yemen is bombarding Israel and carrying out the crime of aggression and violations of the Geneva Conventions and violations of international humanitarian law is just indicative of the double standard that exists in the international community.
Joining me today is Ambassador Alan Baker. He's the director of the Institute for Contemporary Affairs here at JCFA and the head of the Global Law Forum. You also served as the legal advisor and deputy director general of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and as Israel's ambassador to Canada. Thank you very much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
As one Israeli comedian put it, we're experiencing a war within a war. Aside from the war that we've been facing with Hamas in Gaza, then the war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, a sprinkling of Iranian ballistic missile attacks every now and then. For over a year, since Hamas's October 7th attack, the Houthis, the Iranian-backed proxy group in Yemen that controls large parts of the country, that shares absolutely no borders with Israel, has never had any sort of conflict with the Jewish state, has attacked Israel in support of Hamas in Gaza, repeatedly targeting Israeli civilians by firing rockets, long-range ballistic missiles, and drones. We're talking about 300 attacks this year alone. In the past 3 weeks, those attacks have intensified with nearly nightly sirens, sending Israelis, including you and I, to shelters in the unfortunate hour of 4 o'clock in the morning, very so often. And while most of the UN Security Council members have somewhat condemned these Houthi attacks on Israel, although it took them a very long time, they've also somehow condemned the Israeli retaliatory attacks. It's quite perplexing.
Why is it perplexing? You shouldn't be at all surprised. It's the natural way in which the Security Council and the international community operates. I'm not surprised at all. It's been like that for 70-odd years, and nothing has changed, and nothing will change.
I want to give a little bit of context to our viewers who might not necessarily know who the Houthis are. This Iranian proxy group, which has taken control and seized control of large parts of Yemen since the civil war started in 2011. But Yemen itself is it's a independent sovereign entity. It's a member of the UN, party to the Geneva Convention, as well as party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, according to international law, what responsibility does a sovereign country like Yemen bear for these crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, and war crimes that are emanating from its territory?
Well, anything emanating from the sovereign territory of a sovereign state is the responsibility of that state. We could have said so with respect to Lebanon and the Hezbollah. Israel chose to deal only with the Hezbollah, but with respect to the Houthis in Yemen, Yemen is fully responsible. It carries international state responsibility for whatever happens from its territory. And so the address in international law and international practice should be the state of Yemen.
Explain to us, under international law, Israel's right to self-defense when facing these attacks on its civilians from the Houthis.
Well, Israel has got a basic right to self-defense according to Article 51 of the UN Charter, which basically says that once attacked, a state has the right, the inherent right to defend itself. It usually comes together with some type of action from the United Nations, some type of approval. But there's also a customary right of self-defense in international law, which basically says that whenever an attack is imminent and isn't being prevented and is extremely dangerous, then the state has a natural right to defend itself by whatever means.
We failed to mention that in addition to these attacks, these direct attacks on Israeli civilians, the Houthis have also obstructed international shipping through the international straits of Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea. At first, it was targeting any ships that had any sort of relation to Israel, perhaps Israeli-owned international ships that eventually expanded to anything that was related to the U.S., to the U.K., and that has resulted in a U.S.-led coalition to fight these maritime attacks. When we're talking about these maritime attacks, how does Yemen's blockage of shipping violate maritime law?
Well, it says distinctly in the United Nations International Convention on the Law of the Sea from 1982 that states are entitled to complete freedom of navigation without any harassment or impedance through international straits and international waters. And Yemen is directly violating international law from this point of view. So the international community and the UN Security Council are fully justified in adopting resolutions, and these are obligatory resolutions under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, which means that the United Nations can use force in order to apply these resolutions. The fact that they're not really saying very much about the fact that the Houthis or Yemen is bombarding Israel and carrying out the crime of aggression and violations of the Geneva Conventions and violations of international humanitarian law is just indicative of the double standard that exists in the international community.
And when we're talking about this double standard, I mean, it's so obvious for us when we're viewing the situation from Jerusalem, but it's not necessarily obvious to lawmakers on the international playing field abroad. How do you explain to them this double standard that we're experiencing so much live right now through this war?
But this double standard exists everywhere on every aspect, whether it's the war in Gaza or the war in Lebanon or Israel's actions in Syria. Nobody is really prepared to look at the Israeli reasoning and justifications which exist according to international law. The only thing that they're interested in is basically joining together to condemn whatever Israel may do, however justified it is. Now, one can ask, why is this? And I could say, well, it's because of a prevalent anti-Semitism that has always existed and still exists, but also it's a question of their economic and political interests. They just don't want to do anything that might be considered to be positive with respect to Israel.
Yemen never ratified the ICC Rome Statute. How does that impact its accountability?
Well, its accountability, according to international law, exists. It's violating international conventions that Yemen is party to. The International Criminal Court statute deals with individuals. In other words, if somebody wants to accuse the head of the Houthis or the president of Yemen or anybody of carrying out war crimes, they won't be able to do so in the International Criminal Court because Yemen is not a party. But that doesn't prevent the international community from condemning Yemen as a state, whether via the International Court of Justice or resolutions of the UN Security Council, as ineffective and useless as they are.
You mentioned Lebanon earlier, and the fact that we've basically experienced the same predicament that we're facing now with the Houthis in Yemen. We faced also with Hezbollah in Lebanon, where it's a Iranian terror proxy operating from a sovereign country. Talk to us about, as you mentioned, the failures of the international community when it comes to international law to properly address these terror groups that are carrying attacks from a sovereign country. How should they address it?
The international community hasn't got the teeth, hasn't got the means to implement international law as it should be. International law is not like national law, where somebody attacks somebody, you can send a policeman to arrest them and you can bring them to a court and put them on trial and then you can put them in prison. There's no such thing in international law. International law is based on goodwill, on good intentions, on bona fides. And if neither of these or none of these characteristics exist, then it's just a question of, well, we can only hope that these countries will behave themselves. And in the case of the Houthis, because they're basically backed by Iran, it's not something that the Yemenites didn't wake up in the morning and say, it's a nice day, let's attack Israel. Let's fire a few ballistic missiles against Israel because we don't like the Israelis. That's not the case. They're doing it because the Iranians are telling them to do it, and the Iranians are supplying them with the weapons. So, it's called a proxy war, and it happened with respect to Hezbollah as well. The problem of Lebanon was that Lebanon is not really a functioning sovereign country. It hardly exists. Yemen does exist, despite the fact that it's got a multi-pronged civil war going on. But the Houthis are dragging the sovereign state of Yemen into this very deep mud in the international community. And sooner or later, somebody's going to have to do something about it very seriously. And I'm hoping that these various coalitions of states, despite the fact that they're basically trying to protect freedom of navigation, they're really not interested in doing anything about Israel, they'll come to the conclusion that it's the same thing. And therefore they have to act to prevent the Houthis from attacking international shipping, but also to prevent the Houthis from attacking Israel.
There's been a lot of debate here in Israel that in order to make these strikes by the Houthis end, the real solution is to go after the original source, which is Iran. When we're talking about that international legal legitimacy to self-defense, would that fit within those criterias?
Well, this is a vague area in international law, because the international law refers to the fact that an attack emanates from a particular place. It doesn't emanate from Iran. It emanates from Yemen, or it emanated from Lebanese territory, or it emanates from Gaza. It's a problem in international law to attribute this to Iran, and this is something that needs to be developed in international law. International law usually lags behind when it comes to dealing with current issues. And this is one of the example. The use of proxies is something that international law doesn't know how to deal with it. But as things have to proceed, then whether it's the United States or a coalition or together with Israel or without Israel, something will have to be done with respect to Iran.
Ambassador Alan Baker, thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope we don't get woken up by another siren tonight.
Probably will.
Thank you.